She spent her entire career teaching women how to survive violent men. Dr. Amie Harwick was a prominent Hollywood therapist, an expert in domestic abuse, and a fierce protector of the vulnerable. She understood the psychology of a stalker better than almost anyone. Yet, on a cool February night in 2020, that deep professional expertise could not save her. Forced over the edge of her own third-story balcony, she plummeted 20 feet to her death. The legal system designed to protect her had simply expired, and her killer just waited it out. Help this channel grow. Like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe for more cases. This helps us a lot, thank you. Amie Harwick was born in 1981 in a working-class Pennsylvania neighborhood, far removed from the manicured lawns of Southern California. She relocated to Los Angeles in her early 20s, driven by a sharp, calculating ambition to reinvent herself. Unlike the thousands who migrate west chasing screen time, Amie's focus was ruthlessly academic. She financed her early education through alternative modeling and working within the local nightlife and entertainment sectors, a gritty, exhausting grind that exposed her to the raw, often exploitative underbelly of the city. That demanding environment did not harden her. Instead, it cultivated a profound analytical empathy for vulnerable individuals, particularly women navigating predatory environments. Her academic trajectory was relentless. She earned her bachelor's degree in psychology from California Polytechnic State University, followed immediately by a master's degree from Pepperdine University in clinical psychology. She eventually secured a doctorate, officially becoming a licensed marriage and family therapist. Dr. Harwick carved out a highly specific, vital niche in West Hollywood, focusing extensively on sex therapy, domestic battery, and psychological abuse recovery. She authored a comprehensive clinical book on the subject and rapidly became a sought-after expert on podcasts and television panels. Her private practice on Santa Monica Boulevard functioned as a sanctuary for victims of intimate partner violence. Day after day, Amie sat in a quiet, soundproofed room, deconstructing the anatomy of obsession for her traumatized clients. She explicitly taught them how to identify behavioral red flags, how to distinguish genuine affection from pathological control. She detailed the exact mechanisms stalkers use to isolate their targets, mapping out the escalation from unwanted texts to physical intimidation. The bitter, inescapable paradox is that the very pathology she spent thousands of clinical hours dissecting would soon breach the walls of her own personal life. Living and operating in Los Angeles as a prominent media-facing professional inherently strips away layers of anonymity. Amie's visibility was vital for the growth of her practice, but it left her chronically exposed. In the modern digital age, a public profile equates to a permanent, trackable footprint. Her office address, her media appearances, her social circles, everything was readily accessible to anyone with an internet connection. To counteract this digital vulnerability, she heavily fortified her physical reality. She purchased a beautiful, multi-level home tucked away in the Hollywood Hills. The property was an oasis, yet she methodically outfitted it with advanced security cameras, high-definition motion sensors, and reinforced locks on every access point. Amie understood the raw, terrifying data regarding violence against women. She counseled her patients daily that temporary restraining orders were often nothing more than fragile pieces of paper, bureaucratic shields that could not stop a determined aggressor. She did not live in a state of paralyzing paranoia, but she operated with an elite level of situational awareness. She structured her daily routines to minimize risk, documenting unwanted contacts and strictly advising against any engagement with provocations. She knew the psychology of a predator inside and out. She knew that stalkers thrive on a distorted sense of ownership, feeding on the fear and disruption they cause in their victim's routine. Yet, the fundamental flaw in the legal framework is that it forces the victim into a state of perpetual vigilance, while the aggressor only needs a single window of opportunity. Amie's vast expertise provided her with the intellectual tools to predict dangerous behavior, but psychological profiling alone cannot block a physical breach. She had built her entire professional identity around empowering survivors to escape the exact type of lethal obsession that was currently mapping out her own neighborhood, watching her movements and waiting for a legal protective order to expire. The timeline pulls back to the winter of 2011. Before the doctorate, before the thriving Santa Monica practice, Amie attended an industry awards event in Los Angeles. It was a chaotic, sensory-heavy environment. Pulsing strobes, heavy bass rattling the floorboards, a dense crowd of industry professionals and peripheral hangers-on. Among the event photographers was Gareth Pursehouse. He was an imposing figure, standing 6 feet 4 inches, working the room with his heavy camera rig. Their paths intersected. The initial interaction was entirely unremarkable, a standard exchange in a room built for transient networking. He took her picture. They spoke briefly. A relationship formed shortly after, but it was fundamentally fractured from its inception. To outside observers, it appeared to be a standard, perhaps slightly mismatched, Los Angeles pairing. Amie was intensely driven, meticulously mapping out her academic and professional future. Pursehouse, conversely, lacked any forward momentum. He worked freelance technical and photography gigs, existing comfortably on the margins of the entertainment industry. The stark disparity in their ambitions created immediate friction, but the true rot within the dynamic was much deeper. Psychological abuse rarely announces itself with a closed fist. It creeps in quietly, often disguised as deep concern, passion, or a protective instinct. Pursehouse began mapping her boundaries, testing their structural integrity daily. It started with incessant, suffocating text messages when she was away. He demanded constant, real-time updates regarding her location, her companions, and her schedule. If she failed to respond within a narrow, arbitrary window, his messages would abruptly pivot from needy to aggressive. He monitored her digital footprint with clinical precision. This was early in the decade, a time when social media was cementing itself as an unavoidable professional requirement. For Amie, an online presence was mandatory for networking and career growth. For Pursehouse, it was a surveillance grid. He heavily scrutinized her interactions, aggressively questioning her about male colleagues who commented on her posts or attended the same industry events. The jealousy rapidly mutated into absolute possession. By early 2012, the dynamic had deteriorated into active hostility. Amie recognized the toxic architecture of the relationship and attempted to sever ties. That is when the true anatomy of his obsession revealed itself. Rejection did not make him retreat. It activated a relentless, desperate pursuit. Pursehouse simply refused to accept the breakup. He began showing up uninvited at her apartment complex. He loitered in the dim parking lot, sitting in his vehicle for hours, his eyes fixed on her windows. The emotional manipulation quickly escalated into physical intimidation. During one terrifying confrontation, he forced his way into her unit and initiated a systematic destruction of her property. He shattered lamps. He hurled heavy picture frames against the drywall. He completely destroyed her television. The violence was specifically directed at her environment, a classic intimidation tactic designed to demonstrate exactly what he was capable of doing to her physically. The sharp crack of breaking plastic and the dull thud of objects hitting the floor served as a sensory warning. Amie documented the wreckage. She took clear photographs of the shattered glass, quietly building a file that would later support her legal pleas. In June of 2012, the situation reached a critical breaking point. Pursehouse physically assaulted her. He shoved her forcefully to the floor during an argument, resulting in severe bruising and a profound realization that her life was in active danger. Amie immediately filed for a temporary restraining order, detailing the assault, the relentless stalking, and the destruction of her personal property. In the court documents, she explicitly stated her deep-seated fear that he would end her life. The legal system responded by granting the order. He was officially mandated to stay away. For a brief period, the court order acted as a functional deterrent. She sat under the harsh fluorescent lights of a Los Angeles courthouse, securing a legal barrier that allowed her to breathe. But restraining orders possess a fatal flaw. They have expiration dates. The initial mandate was extended, ultimately stretching all the way to 2015. During those highly stressful years, Amie worked exhaustively to erase herself from his radar. She moved to a new address. She heavily altered her daily routines. She plunged entirely into her clinical studies, actively using the severe trauma of that relationship to inform her therapeutic work. She took the raw fear he instilled in her and weaponized it into a brilliant career designed to protect others. As years passed without any physical contact, the immediate threat seemed to neutralize. The legal shield finally expired. In the eyes of the law, the conflict was entirely resolved. The bureaucratic timer had simply run out, erasing the invisible boundaries that kept him at bay. Amie moved forward, building an incredibly successful life, assuming that dark chapter was firmly buried. But obsession does not obey judicial timelines. It ferments in the dark. While Amie was publishing her comprehensive book and appearing on national television, Pursehouse was sinking deeper into a stagnant, bitter reality. He maintained a quiet, invisible vigilance. He watched her rapid ascent from a distance, tracking her success through glowing screens. The legal expiration did not mean he had moved on. It simply meant he no longer had to hide in the shadows. Mid-January 2020. The sprawling hotel complex in downtown Los Angeles hosted the annual X-Biz Awards, a massive, high-energy gala for the adult entertainment industry. Amie attended the event strictly in a professional capacity, networking within her specific clinical demographic. The venue was an assault on the senses. Heavy bass vibrated through the floorboards, erratic strobe lights cut through the dim ballroom, and hundreds of industry professionals packed the aisles. She navigated the chaotic environment with her usual polished confidence. Then, the absolute worst-case scenario materialized. Working the event as a freelance photographer, blending into the swarm of media personnel, was her former abuser. The mathematics of the encounter were highly improbable, yet their paths intersected directly in the center of the crowded hall. The passage of 8 years had done absolutely nothing to dilute his fixation. Observers noted that his psychological collapse was instantaneous and severe. He did not behave like a man bumping into a distant ex-partner. He reacted with the raw, hyperventilating volatility of an open wound. He aggressively blocked her path. His breathing became erratic, his face flushed, and his hands trembled violently. He loudly accused her of ruining his life, his voice cracking with a disturbing blend of rage and desperate entitlement. He demanded closure. He insisted she owed him an explanation for the agonizing pain he claimed to have endured since their legal severing in 2012. He caused a highly localized, deeply uncomfortable spectacle, entirely disregarding the social constraints of the formal gala. Amie relied instantly on her extensive clinical training to de-escalate the immediate physical threat. She kept her tone remarkably level, attempting to neutralize his escalating aggression just enough to secure a physical exit route. She firmly stated she would not engage in this environment, broke eye contact, and rapidly maneuvered through the dense crowd, leaving the venue altogether. But beneath her ironclad professional composure, sheer panic took root. The adrenaline flooded her system. As she drove the miles back to the Hollywood Hills, the terrifying reality settled in. She recognized the exact behavioral markers of a stalker re-engaging. The emotional dam had broken. The dormant obsession was completely reactivated, and worse, the restraining order was long dead. The ensuing weeks were defined by a suffocating, unrelenting dread. Amie explicitly communicated her terror to her closest circle, stating plainly that she believed she was being hunted. She understood the mechanics of his pathology perfectly. That random, chaotic meeting had provided him with a fresh hit of the control he craved. The timer had reset. She immediately went to work hardening her physical environment. Her multi-level home, built into the steep incline of a canyon road, suddenly felt less like a sanctuary and more like a beautifully decorated trap. The architectural features that made the property desirable, expansive glass doors, secluded outdoor spaces, and a sweeping third-story balcony perched roughly 20 feet above the ground, now felt like massive structural vulnerabilities. She tested the deadbolts nightly. She checked the window latches repeatedly. She installed secondary locks on the patio doors. She sent out group messages to trusted friends detailing his erratic behavior at the awards show, intentionally creating a digital paper trail of her escalating anxiety. She shared her live GPS location with her inner circle, a grim precaution for a woman who knew exactly how these patterns typically end. The psychological toll was devastating. Sleep deprivation set in. In the total silence of the Los Angeles canyons, every ambient noise became a potential threat. The snapping of a dry branch, the rush of wind against the glass, the crunch of gravel near the driveway. The most agonizing aspect of the escalation was the complete legal paralysis. When she inquired about reinstating the protective order, the bureaucratic reality proved entirely useless. A verbal confrontation in a public place, no matter how deeply unhinged or psychologically scarring, did not legally constitute a new, prosecutable physical threat. The justice system required fresh violence. She was trapped in the lethal blind spot of stalking laws, forced to wait for an overt crime to occur before the police could intervene. She was completely exposed, and out in the dark, he was mapping the perimeter. February 14th, 2020, Valentine's Day in Los Angeles. The temperature hovered around 55 degrees Fahrenheit, a crisp winter night for Southern California. Amie chose to spend the evening out with a close group of friends at a burlesque show in West Hollywood. It was a conscious decision to reclaim her routine, to override the ambient dread that had dictated her movements for weeks. Photographs from that night show her relaxed, wearing a black dress, seemingly insulated from the threat tracking her geographic coordinates. She left the venue after midnight. The drive back into the Hollywood Hills was a familiar transition from the neon saturation of the city into the dense, unlit, winding roads of her canyon neighborhood. The absolute isolation of these enclaves is their primary selling point. Houses are built into the steep hillsides, shielded by thick vegetation and high retaining walls. At night, the acoustics of the canyon dampen ambient noise entirely. Amie pulled into her driveway at approximately 1:15 a.m. on February 15th. The property was a multi-level structure. Her roommate, Michael, occupied the ground floor bedroom. Amie's living quarters, including the master suite and the sprawling exterior balcony, were located on the third level. The sequence of the next 45 minutes was reconstructed entirely through forensic evidence, blood-spattered geometry, and auditory memory. She unlocked the front door and moved through the silent house. Michael was asleep downstairs. Amie walked up the carpeted stairs to her bedroom. She changed out of her evening clothes and into comfortable loungewear. Everything appeared routine, but the perimeter had already been breached. Investigators later determined that the intruder bypassed the exterior security measures and gained access through a glass French door on the lower level. The entry was forced but highly calculated. The glass panes near the locking mechanism had been deliberately shattered, allowing a hand to reach through and disengage the internal deadbolt. From there, the stalker navigated a dark, unfamiliar floor plan. He bypassed the sleeping roommate entirely, moving vertically through the property, heading straight for the third floor. He was already inside the house, waiting in the dark while she was driving home. The precise moment the ambush was initiated remains locked in the timeline, but the sudden explosion of violence shattered the absolute quiet of the canyon. Down on the first floor, Michael woke instantly. The ceiling above him vibrated. He heard heavy, chaotic footsteps pounding against the hardwood floors upstairs. It was not the sound of a routine argument. It was the distinct, terrifying cadence of a severe physical struggle. Bodies colliding with drywall, heavy furniture being violently shoved across the room. Then, the screams began. Michael later detailed to authorities that he heard Amie yelling. She was screaming for her life. The vocalization was desperate, raw, and indicative of a profound, immediate threat. He leaped out of bed and rushed into the hallway. The stairwell was completely dark. He stood at the base of the stairs, listening to the horrifying acoustics of his friend fighting a losing battle against a massive physical advantage. He searched frantically for his cell phone in the dark to call for help, but in the panic of waking up to a nightmare, his hands swept over empty tables. He could not locate the device. He yelled up the stairwell, attempting to distract the attacker, demanding to know what was happening above him. The response from the third floor was not a voice, but the sickening sound of a heavy body hitting the floorboards. Michael faced an agonizing, split-second calculation. He was unarmed. The narrow staircase was a fatal choke point. Whoever was upstairs had completely overwhelmed Amie, meaning the attacker was violently dangerous and possessed a severe size advantage. If Michael ascended those stairs blind, he would likely become the second casualty, leaving absolutely no one to contact law enforcement. His only viable tactical option was to secure outside help immediately. He abandoned the search for his phone and sprinted for the front door, but the property's security features The exact elements designed to keep threats out now trapped him inside. In his panic, he struggled with the complex deadbolts. Adrenaline severely compromised his fine motor skills. Realizing the front exit was taking too long, he bolted toward the back patio. Michael scaled the perimeter wall. He dropped down into the neighboring yard and began running through the neighborhood. The Hollywood Hills at 1:30 a.m. are a void. There is zero pedestrian traffic. The homes are fortress-like, set far back from the winding asphalt behind heavy iron gates. He pounded on the heavy wooden doors of adjacent houses. He screamed into the void for someone to wake up, to call the police, to open their gates. House after house remained completely dark. Minutes were bleeding away. Every second he spent sprinting barefoot down the abrasive road was a second Amie was fighting alone. Finally, he encountered a neighbor walking down the street, a rare anomaly at that hour. Michael frantically explained the situation, stating that his roommate was being violently assaulted and they required law enforcement immediately. A call was finally placed to 911. While Michael was desperately trying to navigate the geographic dead zone of the canyon to secure help, the violence on the third floor was reaching its absolute climax. Forensic reconstruction indicates a brutal, prolonged confrontation. Amie did not submit. She fought back with immense ferocity. The master bedroom became a contained arena of survival. A heavy television was completely ripped from its wall, mounting and smashed onto the floor. Large patches of drywall were dented and punctured. A string of rosary beads was torn from a surface, the beads scattering across the hardwood. Blood evidence mapped a linear trajectory of resistance. Smears on the door frames indicated an attempt to escape the room. Broken acrylic nails were recovered from the floorboards, a grim testament to her desperate attempts to claw at her attacker's face and arms. The intruder possessed a nearly 100-pound weight advantage. The physics of the assault were brutally asymmetrical. Medical examiners later discovered deep defensive wounds on her hands and forearms. Severe contusions encircled her neck, forming distinct petechial patterns that matched manual strangulation. The cartilage in her throat was fractured. The physical evidence proved that before gravity became the lethal instrument, she was choked to the absolute point of unconsciousness. The attacker managed to force her toward the balcony. The drop from the edge of that third-story ledge to the concrete patio below was approximately 20 feet. The balcony itself featured a standard wrought iron railing standing approximately 40 inches high. It was engineered to prevent accidental falls. A grown woman does not simply trip over a barrier of that height. The trajectory of her descent, the exact distance her body landed from the base of the stucco wall, indicated that she was either propelled forcefully over the ironwork or dropped while she was completely incapacitated. The impact with the ground was catastrophic. A 20-foot fall onto solid concrete generates immense kinetic energy. Silence finally returned to the canyon. The intruder made his exit, slipping back out into the dark labyrinth of the hills, leaving the property exactly as the police would soon find it, a scene of total devastation. At 1:16 a.m., the Los Angeles Police Department received the emergency dispatch regarding a woman screaming in a Hollywood Hills residence. Patrol vehicles navigated the winding roads, their sirens cutting through the night air. They arrived at the property shortly after Michael managed to flag down the neighbor. Officers breached the security gate. Flashlights swept the exterior of the house. Before they even entered the shattered lower-level door or climbed the stairs to witness the destruction of the master suite, their beams caught a form lying on the ground beneath the third-story balcony. Amie was located on the cold concrete patio. She was entirely unresponsive. Her body had absorbed massive blunt force trauma. Her physical state was entirely consistent with a high-velocity impact from a significant vertical drop. The responding officers radioed for immediate medical transport. The paramedics arrived within minutes, initiating trauma protocols right there on the concrete. They worked under the harsh glare of tactical flashlights. The patio quickly became marked with medical debris, discarded gauze, IV wrappings, and the sterile packaging of emergency trauma gear. Despite the catastrophic nature of the fall and the severe injuries sustained during the struggle upstairs, she was still breathing. Her heart was still beating. She was loaded into an ambulance and rushed to Cedars-Sinai Medical Center. The transport involved navigating back down those same treacherous canyon roads at maximum speed. Every pothole and sharp turn complicated the medics' efforts to maintain a stable airway. The medical personnel worked aggressively to stabilize her vitals, fighting against severe internal bleeding and profound cranial trauma. But the physics of the fall and the preceding violence had inflicted irreversible damage. The blunt force trauma had compromised her skeletal structure and internal organs beyond the threshold of surgical repair. Shortly after arriving at the emergency room trauma bay, the clinical team exhausted all intervention options. Dr. Amie Harwick was pronounced dead. By the time the sun crested over the Hollywood Hills on that Saturday morning, the property on Mound Street had been entirely cordoned off by yellow police tape. The Los Angeles Police Department's elite robbery homicide division took control of the site. What they found inside was a blueprint of calculated malice masked initially as a chaotic home invasion. The first tactical sweep of the lower level revealed the shattered French door. Glass fragments were scattered across the expensive rugs, but the detectives immediately noted a glaring inconsistency. Nothing of value had been removed. High-end electronics, designer items, and cash were completely untouched. The intruder had bypassed every easily fenced item on the ground floor and moved with singular, vertical purpose toward the master suite. This was not a burglary. It was an execution. Forensic teams painstakingly documented the third-floor bedroom. The sheer scale of the destruction mapped out a desperate fight for survival. Blood droplets formed a chaotic constellation across the hardwood, leading directly toward the open balcony doors. But amid the overturned furniture and punctured drywall, investigators discovered a piece of evidence that fundamentally altered the trajectory of the entire case. Lying discarded on the floor near the balcony threshold was a plastic syringe. It was fully loaded with a clear, yellowish liquid. Subsequent toxicology reports would reveal the substance to be a highly concentrated, lethal dose of liquid nicotine. This single piece of plastic elevated the crime from a spontaneous act of rage into a cold, meticulously premeditated assassination. The medical examiner's analysis suggested a terrifying theoretical timeline. The intruder had brought the syringe with the explicit intent of injecting the victim, likely planning to stage the death as a bizarre, untraceable overdose or medical anomaly. Nicotine poisoning in such high concentrations induces rapid paralysis and respiratory failure. But the target had fought back with such unforeseen ferocity that the attacker was forced to abandon his chemical weapon, resorting instead to manual strangulation and gravity. Down at the precinct, the surviving roommate sat in a sterile interview room, recounting the nightmare to lead detectives. He explained the timeline of the screams, the heavy impacts shaking the ceiling, and his frantic sprint through the dark neighborhood to secure help. When asked if the victim had any known enemies, the investigation experienced an immediate, massive acceleration. The detectives did not have to conduct a blind manhunt. The victim had effectively solved her own homicide weeks before it occurred. Her digital footprint provided a flawless map pointing directly to the killer. Investigators accessed her recent communications, uncovering the desperate emails, the shared GPS tracking links, and the detailed messages sent to friends regarding the terrifying encounter at the industry awards show. The expired restraining order from 2012 was pulled from the county archives. The suspect pool instantly shrank to a single name. The manhunt for the former photographer began before noon. The midpoint of the investigation was defined by a tense, agonizing waiting game. Law enforcement initially feared the suspect had utilized the hours between the 911 call and daylight to flee the state or cross the international border into Mexico. Tactical units staked out his known addresses, anticipating a heavily armed standoff. Surveillance teams monitored a quiet coastal neighborhood in Playa del Rey, roughly 20 miles south of the crime scene. They located his vehicle parked outside his residence. He had not run. He had simply driven home and gone to sleep. On the afternoon of February 15th, an FBI and LAPD joint task force descended on the Playa del Rey property. Heavily armed operators breached the perimeter and apprehended the suspect without a violent incident. Observers noted that his demeanor during the arrest was strangely passive, entirely disconnected from the brutal kinetic energy unleashed in the canyon just hours prior. He was transported to downtown Los Angeles for booking, while the suspect sat in a holding cell, A massive social echo reverberated through West Hollywood. The news of the tragedy broke across local and national media networks, instantly paralyzing the local therapeutic community. The victim's former patients, dozens of women actively fleeing domestic violence and severe abuse, spiraled into absolute panic. The psychological fallout was devastating. The stark, undeniable reality was that an elite specialist, a woman who possessed every intellectual tool and security measure available, had been hunted down in her own home. Advocacy groups and fellow clinicians publicly voiced their terror, noting that if the system could not protect the expert, the system was entirely broken. The legal machinery, however, soon delivered another shocking blow to that terrified community. Within days of his arrest, the suspect utilized a bail bondsman to post a staggering $2 million bond. Because the initial charges did not yet include certain specialized legal enhancements, the system permitted his temporary release. He walked out of the county jail. The resulting outrage was swift and furious. A man accused of scaling a Hollywood Hills balcony and orchestrating an assassination was suddenly back on the streets of Los Angeles. Lawmakers and public figures demanded immediate intervention. The district attorney's office scrambled to correct the bureaucratic nightmare. Prosecutors aggressively restructured the case, gathering the forensic evidence of the shattered door, the lethal syringe, and the digital paper trail to secure a new, ironclad warrant. They formally refiled the charges, adding the special circumstance of lying in wait. This specific legal enhancement drastically increased the severity of the indictment, making the crime a capital offense. A specialized tactical unit was immediately dispatched back to Playa del Rey. The suspect was rearrested on a no-bail warrant. The heavy iron doors of the Los Angeles County Jail slammed shut, this time locking from the outside permanently. The physical threat was finally neutralized, but the agonizing crawl toward a criminal trial was just beginning. The judicial machinery ground slowly, heavily delayed by global events and endless procedural motions. The trial officially commenced in late August 2023, more than 3 years after the Hollywood Hills perimeter was breached. The courtroom environment was severely clinical, a stark contrast to the emotional devastation the crime had inflicted on the Los Angeles therapeutic community. Prosecutors systematically dismantled the defense's primary narrative. The accused's legal team attempted to frame the fatal night as a spontaneous, tragic accident, a desperate plea for emotional closure that escalated out of control. They argued there was no premeditated intent to kill. The state countered this narrative by directing the jury's attention to the lethal plastic tube recovered from the master suite. A fully loaded nicotine syringe is not an item brought to a conversation regarding closure. It is an instrument of calculated execution. Forensic specialists detailed the DNA material recovered from beneath the victim's broken acrylic nails, confirming the desperate physical struggle that preceded the fall. The psychological profiling presented to the court was chilling. It bypassed the concept of a sudden emotional snap, outlining instead a deep, festering narcissistic injury. The obsession was fueled by an absolute refusal to accept a loss of control. The jury did not struggle with the evidence. In September 2023, after less than 2 days of deliberation, they returned their decision. The verdict was guilty of first-degree murder, explicitly including the special circumstance of lying in wait. 3 months later, the presiding judge delivered the ultimate procedural finality. The perpetrator was sentenced to life in a California state penitentiary without the possibility of parole. The gavel dropped, securing a permanent physical barrier that the expired legal paperwork could not. Yet, the resolution offered a bitter emptiness. A dangerous man was permanently removed from society, but the core systemic failure remained entirely unaddressed. She had possessed a profound elite understanding of predatory psychology. She tirelessly educated vulnerable individuals on how to recognize the encroaching shadow of a stalker. When the threat targeted her directly, she executed every recommended protocol. She fortified her environment and documented the harassment. The tragedy lies in the brutal realization that she did absolutely everything right. The legal framework designed to shield her operated under a fatal delusion, the assumption that pathological obsession obeys an artificial expiration date. The bureaucracy treated a violent fixation as a temporary condition. the system demanded new, prosecutable violence before it would re-engage its protective mechanisms. She recognized the danger the moment the silent perimeter was crossed. She knew the psychological timer had reset, but the law required her to wait until the glass was shattered. By the time that violent threshold was met, the only protection left was a drop into the dark. If you are finished watching, you're a real fan of true crime. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and give it a like. See you in the next video.